You're here with the South African delegation. What are South Africa hoping might come out of Rio+20?
Well, thank you for having me in the studio. South Africa's expectations as a start is that we should not here in Rio lose the political commitment, the political will, as well as some of the agreements and targets that were set both in Johannesburg in 2002 and what happened later afterwards, whether it was at the Conference on Small Island Developing States, as well as the agreement that we reached in Durban at the climate change negotiations. But most importantly, we should not disregard the work that the developing countries are doing towards achieving green goals. And we think that Rio+20 should reaffirm that and come out with an outcome that says we need to support these efforts.
You mentioned Johannesburg because, of course, everyone is talking about Rio+20, and it's easy to forget there was this key summit in Johannesburg 10 years ago. Do the South African delegations, to the South African negotiators who were involved then, do they feel that perhaps the work that was achieved there has been ignored, has been lost?
Well, we don't think so. We think that some of the actual hard work that has come out of Johannesburg is actually the best work that you can currently see in both the United Nations agencies, the development partners, and the individual countries. Before we went to Johannesburg for the summit, not many countries had national strategies for sustainable development. Many countries do have that. In Johannesburg, we came out with concrete agreements on Type 2 partnerships, and we have started seeing a number of partnerships aimed at addressing land degradation, aimed at addressing deforestation, aimed at addressing fisheries, and general issues about biodiversity having elevated since 1992 at Rio. So we think that the work that happened in Johannesburg continue to be flagship of the work we do. The unfortunate part is that issues like trade and development and financing and development seems to have disappeared from whether from Doha or from Monterey.
Finance is obviously a big issue. The Eurozone seems to be in a crisis all the time now. It doesn't seem to ever end. So do you think we can see any progression on finance here in Rio?
Well, the question is what happens if we don't see any progression on finance. And I think that if we don't see any progression on finance, on technology, and on capacity transfer, then we're doomed. Then this would be another UN talk show. But we think that we can make serious efforts. South Africa and the African group's view is that we need to at least escalate the current commitment or the current reality from 0.7% GDP to double that to at least 1.4%, which makes it 100% more, to be able to meet the overseas development assistance commitment in Monterey before Johannesburg. The target was 1%, and we think that we've missed that target. The Millennium Development Goals are behind schedule, and therefore we've got to bring in more money. It goes without saying.
You mentioned the Millennium Development Goals, and in many respects, many of their focus was on Africa, particularly child mortality and fresh water. Do you think it's important that we reaffirm our commitment to those Millennium Development Goals here? And do you think there is space to have more goals, these sustainable development goals that have been talked about?
Well, we think that there is space for an honest discussion about what do you do to the Millennium Development Goals when they reach maturity in 2014. The reality of that is that most of them are far from being met, particularly by African countries. Whilst we think that the next 2 years are going to be critical to try to fast track as much as we can, the idea of sustainable development goals should not be divorced from the fact that we've got goals that we set and they are still active goals. So we need to start saying, what do these SDGs mean? Are they an expansion of the Millennium Development Goals? Are they a mixture of new targets, including green growth targets? Or are they just a new prescription that will keep us focused on new targets instead of continue to accelerate what we've started? But we think that we need some new commitments, a new bond that builds it together, and some sort of goals with targets and dates would actually help.
The Italian Minister for Environment was sitting in the seat you're in 2 days ago. He said it is time for the leading developing countries, and I think he was meaning South Africa in that too, to step up to the table. They now need to take this forward. They need to start cutting their emissions. They need to start cutting pollution. He said it's not just for the developed world to make the effort. What would you say to that?
Well, I must say that the leading developing countries have actually done that. They've taken the lead. In South Africa, for example, in February this year, our Minister of Finance announced a 2.1 billion rand green fund to actually implement some of our climate change flagship projects. That translates into about I would say 500 million US dollars. That's a lot of money for a country like South Africa to commit. But we've also started taking a number of steps in cutting our emissions. We've commissioned new coal-fired power stations, but we've actually put in some of the best technology in the region. We've actually adopted a new energy resource plan that basically says that we'll scale up our energy resources. And even in Durban, we launched South Africa's first massive solar power plant and farm, literally the biggest in Africa. And we've got a number of projects on wind farming in some of our arid areas. And we're actually looking into areas like hydroelectric power, considering some of the recommendations that have come from the World Commission on Dams. It's about water and catchments. So actually we think that we are leading, but most importantly we're building a lot of partnerships with international companies, with development finance institutions to walk the talk, and we think that we are leading, and we're not the only African country that's leading or the developing. I mean, Brazil is leading a revolution on biofuel and bioenergy. India is doing the same. So I can say that within the constraints of our resources and the immediate challenges of our other competing social and economic needs, we are doing the best for what we were 10 years ago.
A final question on poverty. 40 years ago in Stockholm, Indira Gandhi, the then Indian Prime Minister, said that poverty is the biggest polluter. South Africa is in many ways one of the leading countries in Africa and can often speak for the African continent, which is one of the poorest areas of the world. Is enough being done to address the causes of poverty, and should that have a bigger focus here in Rio?
Well, we don't have a choice. The reality of the matter is that the social issues have started disappearing from the Sustainable Development Agenda, whether it is the target on reducing slum dwellers, whether it is a target on sanitation, whether it's a target on sustainable energy. The thing is, the poverty issues have disappeared, and we think that we need to bring them at the core of multilateralism beyond security issues. And therefore, the issue of halving poverty by 2014 remains at the core of our hearts. But poverty for us means access to education. It means addressing the malaria challenge. It means addressing child mortality. It means addressing green jobs, because it is only through those kind of interventions that you can see a real attack on global poverty.